It was a quiet morning when the air in the hospital room suddenly grew thick with tension. Tasha sat alone by the window, gazing out at the soft golden hues of the early light. Cradling her newborn twin boys, Elijah and Isaac, the babies, barely hours old, rested in her arms, their tiny breaths rising and falling in an innocent rhythm. It was a moment of peace, a rare and precious moment of calm after the whirlwind of bringing new life into the world. Tasha felt the weight of her love for them, a love so fierce and unconditional that it consumed her entirely. But her joy was soon overshadowed by an unwelcome presence. The door to the room opened with a soft creak, and in stepped Officer Caleb Mitchell. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a face that bore the scars of a man accustomed to authority. His eyes, cold and narrow, locked onto Tasha with an unsettling intensity. Tasha didn't recognize him at first, but the uniform was enough to tell her that he was a police officer. What she didn't know was that this officer wasn't here for routine hospital business. His arrival had nothing to do with keeping the peace, and everything to do with something darker, something more insidious. Officer Mitchell was a man with a long-standing hatred, and it wasn't for the first time that day, or the first time in his life, that hatred would put everything Tasha loved at risk. He didn't speak at first. He just stood there, his presence looming over her like a storm cloud ready to burst. Tasha could feel his eyes on her, eyes that seemed to scrutinize not just her, but her very existence. She felt it. That same old bitterness that had plagued so many people in her life. This irrational, ugly hatred that came from the simplest and most unforgivable place, race. Tasha had seen it before, in the eyes of those who saw her skin, her heritage, and her family as something less. But she had never expected to encounter it here, in the sacred, vulnerable space of motherhood. With a voice that sounded as cold as the steel of his badge, Officer Mitchell finally spoke. "Give me the children," he said, his words hanging in the air like a threat, sharp and terrifying. Tasha froze, her mind struggling to comprehend what she had just heard. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her voice trembling as she shifted the twins in her arms, instinctively holding them closer to her chest. "Hand them over," Mitchell repeated, taking a step forward, his expression unwavering. "They don't belong here. I'm taking them." Tasha felt a wave of confusion and panic wash over her. She had no idea who this man was or what he wanted. But there was no mistaking the coldness in his voice. The thought that someone, especially a police officer, would come into her hospital room and take her children from her was unfathomable. But Mitchell wasn't done. He stepped closer, his eyes dark with contempt. "You're just a poor, unworthy mother," he sneered. "Those kids don't belong to you. They don't belong in this world. I'm doing what needs to be done." His words were like daggers. They stabbed at her, each sentence aimed at tearing down everything she held dear, her love for her children, the life she had worked so hard to build. But more than that, they struck at her as a woman, as a mother, as a person who had done nothing but pour love and care into her children. Tasha's heart raced. She felt the blood drain from her face. The first wave of fear hit her, a gut-wrenching, all-encompassing terror. But beneath that fear, there was a fierceness that took hold of her. This was her family, her children. No one, not even a man in a uniform, would take them from her. Before she could speak again, the door opened, and there stood David, her husband, David Brooks, the man she had married, the father of her children, stood in the doorway. The presence of his strength immediately shifted the air in the room. He had been out of the hospital for a few hours, dealing with a few last-minute legal matters. But his calm, steady demeanor had never left her thoughts. He was a judge, a man who had fought for justice all his life. He had a presence that was impossible to ignore, a silent strength that emanated from every fiber of his being. And now, his gaze fell upon Officer Mitchell, who seemed to bristle under it. "What's going on here?" David asked, his voice low, but tinged with an unmistakable edge of authority. He didn't need to say more. The tension in the room was palpable. And the officer's intentions were clear. Mitchell, now startled by David's sudden appearance, tried to regain control of the situation. "I'm taking these children," he said, a thinly veiled threat in his words. "They don't belong with you. With people like you." David didn't flinch. Instead, he took a step forward, his gaze locking onto Mitchell with a cold, unyielding intensity. "You will not take my children," David said firmly, his voice unwavering. "You have no right." Tasha watched, her heart swelling with a combination of relief and admiration. David had always been the calm in the storm, the one who would never back down from a fight, especially when it came to protecting his family. The way he stood before Mitchell, so composed, so resolute, made her heart beat faster. He wasn't just her husband, he was her protector. And in this moment, he was her anchor. For a long moment, there was silence. Officer Mitchell seemed to hesitate, uncertainty creeping into his expression for the first time. But that hesitation didn't last. His hatred, his bitterness, was too powerful to be swayed so easily. He straightened up, as though trying to regain some form of control. But David wasn't about to let him. "You will leave now," David said, his voice carrying the weight of years of dedication to justice. His words were not a request, they were a command. Officer Mitchell stood there for a beat longer, his hands clenched into fists, his face turning red with rage. But he knew he had lost. With one final glare at David and Tasha, Mitchell turned and walked out of the room, his footsteps echoing in the stillness. Tasha exhaled deeply, feeling as if she had just emerged from the depths of a nightmare. She looked at David, her heart filled with a profound gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered, holding the twins close to her chest. David smiled softly, though his eyes were hard with the weight of what had just transpired. "You don't have to thank me. I will always protect you. Both of you." It was then that Tasha realized, with a deep sense of clarity, that no matter the darkness the world might throw their way, the love and strength between them was unbreakable. And together, they would fight for their family, no matter the cost. The moment Officer Mitchell left the room, a silence descended that felt too heavy to bear. Tasha sat there, cradling her twin boys, Elijah and Isaac, still shaken by the encounter. Her heart had not stopped racing, and her mind spun with disbelief at what had just occurred. But even in the haze of shock, one thing was clear: she knew her husband would stand by her. Always. David had always been a steady rock, a constant force in her life. But seeing him here now, standing tall against an officer of the law, reminded her just how much power his integrity held. Tasha could not suppress a tear from rolling down her cheek. It wasn't out of fear, but gratitude. She had never doubted David's resolve, but seeing him in action, taking control of the situation with such grace, filled her with awe. David took a step toward her, his eyes never leaving her face. "You're okay?" he asked, his voice softer now, laced with concern. Tasha nodded, though she still felt a tight knot in her stomach. "I'm fine now. Just shaken." She glanced at the door, almost expecting Mitchell to return, but the sound of his footsteps had long since faded. David sat beside her, his strong arm reaching out to gently touch her shoulder. His touch was grounding, reminding her that they were in this together. "We need to figure out what he was trying to do," he said, his tone now steady and purposeful, though there was a flicker of anger beneath it. "There's no reason a cop should act like that, especially toward our family." Tasha nodded again, but the reality of what had just happened began to settle in. "It wasn't just about taking our babies. There's something more to it. I could feel it in the way he looked at me. This wasn't a random act of aggression." David's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, Tasha saw the weight of his career as a judge in his expression. He had spent years confronting injustice in the courtrooms. But this felt personal. It was clear to her that the officer's actions had touched a raw nerve in him, igniting something deep inside. "Malik," Tasha said, her voice trembling slightly, "this isn't just about you and me. It's about something much bigger." David's expression softened at the sound of her voice. But there was no mistaking the resolve in his eyes. He reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. "You're right. I've fought for justice my whole life. But this is different. This is my family. My boys." His voice cracked. But only for a brief second. Before it steadied again. "No one gets to threaten my family." Tasha's heart swelled with pride. She had known that David had a fire inside him. But she hadn't seen it burn this brightly in years. Her husband wasn't just a judge, he was a man who, no matter the situation, would fight for what was right. The love they shared was a force of its own. And it was more than enough to face whatever came their way. "Then we fight," she said, her voice firm. "We don't let them win." David leaned forward, brushing his hand against Elijah's soft hair. Then Isaac's. His gaze lingered on their faces for a moment before returning to Tasha. "We do what we have to do. Together." In that instant, Tasha knew that they were facing a battle much bigger than any single moment of confrontation. This wasn't just about Officer Mitchell's bigotry, nor about the threat to their children. This was about standing up to a system that had allowed such hatred to flourish for far too long. David kissed her forehead, a gentle reassurance that, no matter what, they would navigate this together. But in his kiss, Tasha also felt something more, a deep well of determination. She knew her husband wouldn't rest until this officer's actions were exposed, and until his corruption was held accountable. For David, this wasn't just a personal battle, it was a matter of justice. And no one, not even a man in uniform, could escape that. "Let's start with getting some answers," David said quietly, standing up. And with that, the next chapter of their fight began. One rooted in love, unyielding in its conviction, and driven by the belief that justice would always rise above fear. The officer might have hoped to tear them apart. But what he didn't understand was that the bond between David and Tasha and the love for their children was unbreakable. This would be a fight they would win. Not through force, but through something far more powerful, truth and the will to stand firm against injustice. As they left the hospital room hand in hand, the air between them hummed with an energy that could not be denied. The fight was just beginning. But one thing was certain, they were ready for it. The road they had walked together wasn't one of ease, but of purpose. Malik and Tasha had known hardship before, but it was their love, built over years of mutual respect and unwavering support, that had kept them grounded. It was more than just a partnership, it was a shared commitment to something greater: justice, compassion, and the promise of a better world for their children. Tasha had met Malik during their college years, a time when they were both passionate about social change. Malik, even back then, was driven by a deep sense of justice. He had been the type of person who didn't just talk about change, he sought it out, fought for it, and made it happen. Tasha had admired his resolve from the moment they met. He had an aura about him, quiet yet strong, principled yet kind. They bonded over their shared ideals. Tasha had been working part-time as a volunteer in a community center while completing her studies in social work. She had always known that helping others was her calling. But it was in meeting Malik that she realized the depth of her own potential. Together, they had been an unstoppable force, supporting each other's dreams while also creating new ones. Tasha never doubted Malik's ambition to become a judge. It was a role he had always been drawn to. The sense of power and responsibility that came with shaping the justice system. But, to him, it was more than just about wearing a robe or sitting in a courtroom. It was about doing the right thing even when it wasn't easy. It was about giving a voice to those who had been silenced. And, more than anything, ensuring fairness, especially in a world that often overlooked people like them. And so, They made their way forward, side by side, eventually married. And then the day came when they were blessed with their twin boys, Elijah and Isaac. The joy of becoming parents, however, wasn't just about adding to their family, it was about expanding their vision. It was about creating a world where their children could grow up free of the prejudice and hatred that they themselves had been exposed to. The dream was always simple: for a better future for Elijah and Isaac, for their community, and for themselves. As a judge, Malik had seen his fair share of injustices. He had sentenced many guilty criminals to prison. But it was the cases that weighed heaviest on his heart, the ones involving systemic inequality, that had motivated him to push harder. The law was a tool. But sometimes, it was a tool used to oppress rather than liberate. His purpose was to use that tool to break down the barriers, to hold those accountable who perpetuated harm in the system. Tasha had always stood by him, not just as his wife, but as an equal partner in their mission. She had left social work to become a community organizer, helping to bring resources to neighborhoods that lacked support. She was a fierce advocate for children, working with families who had been torn apart by systemic failures. She believed in giving people a chance to rebuild, to heal, and to rise from the ashes of their circumstances. Her work had earned her recognition. But it was never about recognition for her. It was always about the people she served. Through the years, they had faced challenges, both personal and professional. Their marriage had not been without struggles. Late nights at the courthouse, endless paperwork, and the emotional toll of their work sometimes left them feeling drained. But they always found their way back to each other, always found the strength to keep going. Because their love was rooted in something much deeper than the daily struggles. When Elijah and Isaac were born, it felt like a new chapter of their lives. They had spent so long fighting for justice in the abstract. But now, it was personal. Their love for their children made every sacrifice worth it. And it was this love that fortified them when the darkness of hate crept into their lives in the form of Officer Mitchell. The officer had crossed a line that Malik and Tasha had long feared. The racism that still thrived beneath the surface of their society was never more apparent than in that hospital room. When Officer Mitchell had dared to threaten their family, it was a reminder of the ugliness that lingered just below the surface, even in institutions that were supposed to protect and serve. But Malik and Tasha were no strangers to adversity. They had faced it before. And they would face it again, with their children by their side. And their hearts filled with the same unwavering commitment to justice that had defined their lives together. Now, as they prepared to face the aftermath of that terrible encounter, they understood one truth above all: their fight wasn't just for them, it was for everyone who had ever been silenced, marginalized, or oppressed. And they would not back down. Officer Mitchell wasn't the kind of man who easily attracted attention. At least not in the way one might expect. He was the sort of officer who blended into the background, carrying out his duties with a chilling efficiency. He had a history in the police force, one that had not been without incidents. Though his behavior was often swept under the rug by those who turned a blind eye to his misdeeds. To the community, he appeared to be just another officer in uniform, a face that might occasionally appear on the news for a routine case. But those who were close to the police department knew better. They knew his true nature. Mitchell's rise in the force had been marked by a series of questionable decisions, ones that hinted at a deep-seated prejudice and a strong sense of superiority. It wasn't something that was immediately obvious to most, it was in his glances, his remarks, and the subtle way he treated people differently based on the color of their skin. He hid behind his badge, using his position of power to intimidate, manipulate, and oppress those who couldn't fight back. The officer had made a name for himself in certain circles within the department, a name built on his willingness to uphold the status quo, no matter how corrupt or broken it was. He was one of those officers who viewed the law not as a tool for justice, but as a shield for his own biases. And it was this very shield that allowed him to maintain his career despite a series of internal investigations into his conduct, which had always ended with minimal consequences. His behavior was tolerated, overlooked, even excused. It wasn't until his encounter with Malik and Tasha that Mitchell's actions reached a breaking point. There was a reason Officer Mitchell had such a personal vendetta against Malik. The root of his hatred went beyond any singular event. It was a culmination of years of resentment, frustration, and a deep, irrational fear of people like Malik. In Malik, Mitchell saw someone who challenged everything he stood for. Malik's success in the legal world, his role as a judge, his eloquence in defending the disenfranchised, it was all an affront to the fragile superiority Mitchell had carefully cultivated. To him, Malik was a symbol of everything he despised, someone who had taken what he believed should have been his. Years ago, when Malik had first become a judge, Mitchell had been quick to voice his displeasure. He believed that someone like Malik didn't deserve such a position. His resentment simmered beneath the surface, but it was always disguised as concern for order or tradition. Mitchell saw Malik as a threat, a reminder of the changing tides he feared. What he didn't realize was that his animosity toward Malik wasn't just about him, it was a reflection of something deeper. A discomfort with the progress of society itself, and his place in it. The deeper truth was that Officer Mitchell, despite his authority and his badge, felt weak. His fragile sense of power was constantly at odds with the changing world around him. He was one of the last remnants of an old guard, one that believed the world should be divided along lines of race and class, with people like him at the top. But Malik, with his quiet strength, his commitment to fairness, and his unyielding belief in the rule of law, represented a direct challenge to that hierarchy. And when Mitchell walked into that hospital room, with the intention of taking Elijah and Isaac, it wasn't just about controlling Malik's family, it was about something much bigger. It was about reasserting his power, his dominance over a system that he felt was slipping away from him. He thought that by taking the twins, by using his authority as a weapon against a family he loathed, he could reaffirm his place in a world that was rapidly changing. A world where he no longer felt in control. But in that moment, he underestimated one crucial thing: Malik. He didn't understand the depth of Malik's strength, the resilience of a man who had fought against much worse. Mitchell thought his badge would protect him, but he was wrong. And as Malik and Tasha began to fight back, the officer's grip on the situation began to falter, his facade of power starting to crumble. It was the beginning of the end for Mitchell, though he hadn't yet realized it. His prejudiced history, built on years of unchecked power and bias, had finally caught up with him, and it was about to cost him everything. The aftermath of that harrowing night at the hospital marked a pivotal moment for Malik. The weight of what had happened to his family settled heavily on his shoulders. Officer Mitchell's attempt to steal his children wasn't just an isolated incident, it was part of a broader, more insidious pattern of corruption that extended far beyond that hospital room. Malik knew this wasn't merely a personal battle. It was a fight for justice, for accountability, and for a system that had failed countless others like him. Despite the emotional turmoil he and his wife, Tasha, were experiencing, Malik's resolve only strengthened. He wasn't just determined to protect his family. He was determined to bring Mitchell to justice, to expose the officer for what he truly was, and to dismantle the corrupt network that had allowed men like him to thrive unchecked. The first steps in his pursuit were the most difficult. Malik wasn't a private investigator, he was a judge, a man of the law. But this wasn't a case he could trust to the system as it was. He knew that if he were to wait for the wheels of bureaucracy to turn, Mitchell would slip through the cracks as he had done so many times before. It was going to take more than paperwork and court dates. Malik needed evidence, and he needed to act quickly. Thankfully, he wasn't alone. He turned to an old friend, Detective Lisa Green, who had worked alongside him on a number of high-profile cases. She was one of the few officers in the department who had a reputation for honesty and integrity. Together, they began to quietly gather information on Officer Mitchell's history, digging into his past arrests, complaints filed against him, and the disturbing pattern of misconduct that had always been swept under the rug. It wasn't easy. Mitchell was well connected, his influence woven deep into the fabric of the department. But Malik's focus never wavered. He knew what was at stake. One evening, Malik and Lisa sat at a quiet diner, the fluorescent lights overhead casting a dim glow on the scattered paperwork between them. Malik's fingers ran across a series of files, witness statements, internal reports, and disciplinary records. There it was. Hidden beneath layers of bureaucracy, a long history of complaints against Mitchell, ranging from excessive force to racial profiling. In each case, Mitchell had been cleared, his actions dismissed as justified or simply overlooked. But the records painted a clearer picture. Officer Mitchell had been systematically abusing his position for years. And it was time someone held him accountable. "This is it," Malik said, his voice steady but laced with a quiet anger. "This is the proof we need." But there was more to be done. They needed more witnesses. More people who had suffered at Mitchell's hands. People who had been too afraid to speak out. Malik wasn't naive, he knew the risks involved. Mitchell's connections in the department made him a dangerous man. And those who had encountered him were often left with the fear that any attempt to expose him could lead to retaliation. But Malik also knew that silence was no longer an option. With Detective Green's help, they began to locate victims willing to testify. Each story was more harrowing than the last. People who had been stopped for no reason, falsely accused, or even physically harmed during routine police interactions. As these brave individuals came forward, Malik's anger deepened. This wasn't just about one officer. It was about a system that had allowed him to operate with impunity for far too long. But the stakes were high. Malik could feel the pressure mounting from every direction. Mitchell had caught wind of the investigation. And with it came the threats. Anonymous messages. Strange cars parked outside his home. The sense of being watched. He didn't flinch. His resolve only grew stronger, bolstered by the knowledge that this wasn't just about him or his family. This was about creating change. About dismantling the oppressive systems that had held people like him down for so long. At home, Tasha stood by his side, offering support and solace even when the emotional toll was overwhelming. She saw the weight on his shoulders. But she also saw the fire in his eyes, the same fire that had driven him to become a judge in the first place. She knew the dangers he was facing. But she also knew that Malik wasn't one to back down. "You can't change the world overnight, Malik," she told him one evening, her voice soft but firm. "But you can start. And sometimes, that's enough." Malik's heart swelled with gratitude for her unwavering support. He knew she was right. They couldn't change everything at once. But they could change this. And with each step they took, with each piece of evidence they uncovered, they were getting closer to holding Officer Mitchell accountable. But Malik also knew the consequences would be far-reaching. Bringing Mitchell down wasn't just about justice for his family, it was about sparking a larger movement. It was about challenging a corrupt system that had perpetuated the abuse of power for too long. Malik was no longer fighting for justice in isolation. He was fighting for everyone who had been silenced. For everyone who had been oppressed. For everyone who had suffered at the hands of a system that was supposed to protect them. The battle was just beginning. But Malik's determination was unwavering. He wouldn't stop until justice was served. The days leading up to the trial were some of the most intense and exhausting Malik had ever faced. The evidence against Officer Mitchell was solid. But Malik knew that bringing him to justice would not be as simple as presenting facts in court. The corruption ran deep. And the power dynamics within the police force were entrenched. Malik was no longer just fighting for the truth, he was challenging a system that had protected the likes of Mitchell for years. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was thick with tension. Every seat was filled with those eager to witness the trial of the officer who had terrorized so many lives. News outlets were in attendance, covering the case as it unfolded, while a crowd of supporters filled the gallery. Victims, activists, and citizens who had followed Malik's campaign for justice. Their presence was a reminder that this case was about more than just one officer. It was about accountability. About forcing change within an institution that had failed so many. Malik stood at the front of the courtroom. His heart steady but his mind sharp with focus. He had seen this place countless times before. But today it felt different. Today, he wasn't just a judge presiding over cases. He was fighting for a future where the corrupt could no longer hide behind their badges. Every decision he made, every word he spoke, carried the weight of all the people who had suffered in silence for so long. On the other side of the courtroom sat Officer Mitchell, his defiant posture and bitter glare betraying his arrogance. He had always believed he was untouchable, his connections and influence shielding him from any real consequences. But now, here he was, facing a trial that threatened to undo everything he had worked to protect. Mitchell's lawyer, a slick and well-connected figure, did his best to downplay the charges, casting doubt on the testimonies and trying to discredit the victims who had come forward. His tactics were predictable, attempting to twist the facts and make the case seem less about abuse of power and more about personal vendettas or misunderstandings. Malik wasn't fooled. He had seen enough to know the truth. The testimonies of the victims who had come forward, each one recounting a different instance of Mitchell's brutality, were devastating. But it wasn't just their stories that were damning. It was the pattern of behavior that had been ignored for far too long, the series of complaints that had never been addressed, and the officers who had turned a blind eye to Mitchell's actions because of his standing within the department. Tasha sat in the gallery, her presence a constant source of strength for Malik. He could feel her gaze on him whenever he needed it most, reminding him of what he was fighting for. Her unwavering support was a grounding force amid the chaos. The courtroom, filled with whispers and tension, felt less daunting when he remembered that he wasn't alone. As the trial progressed, Malik began to speak, his voice calm but firm as he addressed the court. He wasn't just presenting the facts, he was weaving together the stories of those who had been hurt, giving a voice to the victims who had been silenced for so long. Malik's words were powerful not just because of the evidence, but because of the conviction that pulsed through them. He wasn't asking for justice. He was demanding it. The defense, as expected, continued to push back, trying to cast doubt on the integrity of the case. Mitchell's lawyer tried to suggest that the victims were motivated by personal bias or a desire for revenge. But Malik wasn't having it. He patiently dismantled each argument, pointing out the flaws and inconsistencies in the defense's tactics. But Malik knew that this trial wasn't just about the facts, it was about power. It was about the hidden forces at play that had allowed Officer Mitchell to operate with impunity for so long. The courtroom became a battleground, where Malik wasn't just seeking justice for the victims of Mitchell's crimes. He was calling for a systemic change. With each passing day, the tension in the courtroom grew. The weight of the case pressed down on everyone involved. But Malik remained resolute. He had never backed down from a fight for justice. And this was no different. He wasn't just representing himself or his family. He was fighting for the future, for the people who had trusted him to bring about change. As the trial neared its conclusion, Malik knew that a decision would soon be made. But it was far from over. Even if Mitchell was convicted, the battle for justice and reform would continue. Malik would not rest until every last vestige of corruption had been rooted out. He knew that change wasn't going to come easily, but it was the only option. For the first time in a long while, Malik allowed himself to believe that, perhaps, this was the beginning of something bigger, something that could finally right the wrongs of the past. The final moments of the trial arrived with a sense of inevitability. The weight of the evidence, the testimonies, and the actions of Officer Mitchell had left no room for doubt. Yet, despite the overwhelming case against him, Mitchell remained defiant. Sitting at the defendant's table, he exuded an air of arrogance, convinced that his position within the system would protect him. His sneer never wavered, even as the truth of his actions was laid bare in the courtroom. Malik stood tall, unshaken by Mitchell's contemptuous demeanor. He had heard it all before: the threats, the insults, the smears. But what Mitchell didn't understand was that Malik was no longer just a judge. He was the voice of justice for everyone who had ever been wronged by a system that had failed them. Malik wasn't just fighting for this case. He was fighting for every victim whose cries had gone unheard. The defense made its final arguments, a desperate attempt to salvage something from the wreckage of their case. Mitchell's lawyer tried to portray him as a victim, a man whose actions had been misinterpreted, whose good intentions had been clouded by circumstance. It was a feeble attempt to shift blame. But it was too late. The truth had already been spoken. As Malik rose to deliver his closing statement, the room fell silent. His voice was calm but resolute, each word carefully chosen, each sentence imbued with the weight of everything he had witnessed. He didn't just talk about the facts of the case, he talked about the human cost of Mitchell's actions. He spoke of the lives that had been shattered, the families that had been torn apart, and the trust that had been broken. But more than anything, Malik spoke of the change that had to come. He reminded the court that justice wasn't just about punishing one man. It was about ensuring that no one, no officer, no institution could ever again operate with the impunity that Mitchell had enjoyed. When Malik finished, there was a brief moment of stunned silence. The air seemed to hang heavy, as if the very soul of the courtroom had been laid bare. Malik didn't wait for the jury's verdict. He knew what was coming. He knew that Mitchell's days of evading accountability were over. It was only a matter of time. The jury deliberated for what felt like an eternity. Malik sat at his desk, his eyes scanning the faces of those in the gallery. He saw Tasha, her hands clenched in anticipation, her gaze fixed on him. He saw the victims who had come forward, each one carrying their own trauma, their own scars. And he saw the faces of those who had stood by him, unwavering in their belief that justice was worth fighting for. Finally, the jury returned, and the forepersons stood to deliver their verdict. The courtroom was still, the tension almost unbearable. Malik held his breath as the words were spoken. After careful consideration of all the evidence presented, we find Officer Caleb Mitchell guilty of all charges. The words hung in the air. And for a moment, time seemed to stand still. Malik felt a surge of relief. But it was tempered by the realization that this was just one battle in a much larger war. The conviction of Officer Mitchell was a victory. But it was not the end. Mitchell's face twisted in rage, his disbelief palpable. He had convinced himself that he was untouchable, that the power he wielded within the system would shield him from any real consequences. But now, as the judge read out the sentence, Malik saw something in Mitchell's eyes that he had never seen before: fear. The sentence was clear: Mitchell was stripped of his badge and sentenced to prison time. The courtroom erupted in applause, the sound a testament to the years of pain and suffering that had been endured by so many. Malik stood firm, allowing himself just a brief moment to acknowledge the victory. He knew this was a step forward, but the fight was far from over. As Mitchell was led away, Malik locked eyes with Tasha. He could see the pride in her gaze. But there was something else there too, a quiet understanding. They had come through this together. And though the road ahead would be long, they were stronger for it. The conviction was not just a personal victory for Malik. It was a victory for everyone who had ever been silenced by fear. For every person who had ever felt powerless in the face of corruption. The work was far from done. But as Malik watched Mitchell being led out of the courtroom, he allowed himself a fleeting sense of satisfaction. Justice had been served. And for the first time in a long while, Malik felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. The courtroom was still buzzing with energy, but Malik could feel the weight of the moment settling in as the trial's aftermath began. Caleb Mitchell's conviction was a victory, yes. But it was also a reminder that the work was far from over. The applause in the courtroom had faded, replaced by the quiet hum of people exchanging looks and whispers. It was as if the air itself was filled with a collective sense of both relief and apprehension. Malik left the courtroom with a sense of purpose. Yet his heart felt heavy. The battle for justice had been won on this front. But the war was far from over. As he made his way out of the building, the noise of the city felt distant, muted somehow. He was acutely aware of the responsibility that now rested on his shoulders, not just for the victims of Caleb's actions, but for the countless others whose stories had yet to be heard. It wasn't long before Malik was back at his desk, reviewing the stacks of case files that had accumulated over the months. He had promised to bring change. And now, with Mitchell behind bars, it was time to turn his focus toward the systemic issues that had allowed men like him to thrive in the first place. As Malik looked over the documents in front of him, his mind raced. There were patterns here. Patterns of abuse, neglect, and a failure to address corruption within the system. He had seen it before. Time and time again, officers who were protected, whose misconduct was swept under the rug because of their power and influence. How many more are out there? Malik muttered to himself, though the question was more rhetorical than anything. The truth was, he didn't know. But he was determined to find out. Malik's phone buzzed on his desk, pulling him out of his thoughts. It was Tasha. He smiled briefly, knowing that their shared experience had forged a bond between them that went beyond mere professional respect. She had been there from the beginning, offering support when things seemed impossible. Malik answered the call, his voice steady but tinged with exhaustion. Malik. It's over. Mitchell's done. We did it. Tasha's voice was full of emotion, but there was an underlying note of caution. A reminder that this was just one battle won. I know. Malik replied, his tone somber. But this is only the beginning. We've got to keep pushing. Mitchell was just a symptom of a much larger problem. Tasha sighed. I know. And I'll help however I can. Just, don't burn yourself out. Okay. Malik glanced at the mountain of paperwork on his desk, the weight of his obligations pressing in on him. I'll be fine, he said, though he wasn't sure if he believed it. Their conversation shifted to plans for the next steps, initiating a deeper investigation into the police department, working with community leaders to advocate for reform, and gathering allies from within the system who were willing to expose the rot that had been festering beneath the surface. Malik knew that the road ahead would be long and fraught with resistance. But it was a road he was willing to walk. As the days passed, the momentum of Mitchell's conviction began to shift the conversation in the city. The media, once skeptical of Malik's pursuit of justice, now started to cover the story with renewed interest. Victims of police misconduct who had once been too afraid to speak up now found themselves with a glimmer of hope. They saw in Malik a symbol of what could be proof that change was possible if the right people fought for it. Malik knew, however, that the road to real reform was filled with obstacles. Even though Mitchell was locked away, the power structures that had protected him were still in place. And those in power weren't going to relinquish their control without a fight. There would be pressure, threats, and attempts to discredit everything he had accomplished. But Malik had never been one to back down. Later that evening, as he sat down with Amora at their dinner table, Malik couldn't shake the feeling that things were shifting not just in the city, but within himself as well. He had always fought for justice. But now, he had a new understanding of what that really meant. It wasn't just about winning cases. It was about challenging a system that had been designed to protect the powerful at the expense of the vulnerable. And the fight for justice, he knew, would be ongoing for as long as it took. Amora reached across the table, placing her hand on his. Her eyes were soft but filled with the same unwavering support that had always been there. She knew the toll this had taken on him. And yet, she also knew that he would not stop. You did good today, she said quietly. But don't forget to take care of yourself. We're in this together. Malik squeezed her hand, a small smile breaking through the exhaustion on his face. I won't forget. We're just getting started. The sun had long since dipped below the horizon as Malik made his way to the police station for his meeting with Chief Robert Hayes. The atmosphere in the city was tense, and it felt as though every step Malik took was charged with the weight of the work that lay ahead. His conviction of Caleb Mitchell was just one victory. But there were far more battles to be fought, and now, Malik needed to face the very heart of the system that had allowed men like Mitchell to wreak havoc. The chief's office was tucked away in a corner of the station, its heavy wooden door a symbol of the power and influence that Hayes held. Malik had always known that Chief Hayes was a man of principle. But in recent months, Malik had started to question just how deep those principles ran. The chief had been reluctant to take a hard stance against Mitchell in the past. And while there was no denying his public support for the conviction, Malik had seen enough of the political games being played behind closed doors to know that things weren't as simple as they seemed. As Malik entered the office, he found Hayes sitting behind his desk, his brow furrowed in thought. The chief's demeanor was calm, but there was a subtle tension in his eyes, a hesitance that Malik had noticed more and more in recent weeks. "Judge Brooks," Hayes greeted, standing to shake Malik's hand. There was no warmth in the gesture, just the polite formality that came with their shared professional standing. "I'm glad you could make it." "Thank you, Chief," Malik replied, taking a seat across from him. His tone was polite, but the tension in his chest was palpable. This was not a social call. He had come to address the growing problem of police corruption that had protected men like Caleb Mitchell for far too long. "I wanted to talk about the next steps," Malik began. "The conviction of Mitchell is a victory, but it's only one piece of a much larger puzzle. I've seen the damage done by men like him, and I know there are others like him out there, hiding behind their badges. It's time we address the systemic issues within the department." Chief Hayes sighed, leaning back in his chair. "You're asking for a full investigation, I take it?" Malik nodded. "Yes. We need to root out the corruption that runs deep within the ranks. We need transparency, accountability, and the willingness to face the truth, no matter how uncomfortable it might be." Hayes was quiet for a moment, his fingers tapping lightly on the surface of his desk. "You're asking a lot, Malik. A full investigation could shake the very foundation of this department. Some of the officers involved have been here for decades. They're well connected. This isn't going to be easy." "I know," Malik said, his voice steady. "But it's necessary. How many more lives will be destroyed before we take action? How many more innocent people will suffer because we're afraid to confront the truth?" The chief's gaze shifted downward, as if weighing the words carefully. Malik could see the conflict in his eyes. Hayes had built his career within this system, and now, he was being asked to dismantle it. "I'm not saying you're wrong," Hayes replied slowly, "but there are forces at play here that you might not fully understand. You have no idea the pressure I'm under from the city council, from the higher-ups. They want everything to remain stable. They don't want a scandal. Not now. Not after everything that's already happened." Malik leaned forward, his voice firm. "What's more important, Chief? Stability at the cost of justice? Or doing what's right, even if it means upending everything?" There was a long pause before Hayes spoke again, his voice resigned. "I don't have an easy answer for you, Malik. But I do have something to say. I'll back you on this. If you're serious about rooting out the corruption, I'll give you access to the information you need. But be prepared, there will be consequences. Powerful people will make their voices heard, and they won't go down without a fight." Malik's heart pounded in his chest. This was the breakthrough he had been hoping for. But it came with a heavy price. He knew that taking on the police department in this way would put him at odds with some of the most powerful figures in the city. But he had come too far to turn back now. "I understand," Malik said, standing up. "I'll be ready." As he left the office, the weight of the chief's words lingered in the air. Malik knew that the path ahead would not be easy. There would be pressure, threats, and countless attempts to intimidate him into silence. But he also knew that he had a responsibility to the people he had sworn to serve. He had taken an oath to seek justice. And that was a promise he intended to keep. No matter the cost. The fight for truth and accountability had only just begun. Malik sat at his desk late into the night. The hum of his computer the only sound in the dimly lit office. The weight of the investigation bore down on him. But it was not the kind of burden that could be put aside. He had uncovered more layers of corruption within the department than he had initially imagined. Each new revelation brought him closer to the heart of the problem. But it also exposed just how deep the rot ran. This wasn't just about one bad officer. Caleb Mitchell. This was a systemic issue. A culture of silence and complicity that had festered for far too long. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of his phone buzzing on the desk. He glanced at the screen. It was Detective Jordan Hayes, his trusted ally in the fight for justice. Malik answered, his voice tired but resolute. "Jordan." "Malik. We need to talk." Jordan replied, his tone serious. "I've got something." Malik sat up straighter, the weariness in his body forgotten for a moment. "What is it?" "There's a bigger network involved in this. I've traced some of the shady deals back to officers higher up in the ranks. Even to some of the city officials you thought you could trust. It's a lot deeper than we thought." Malik's heart sank. This wasn't just a department issue anymore. This was political. He had suspected as much. But hearing it from Jordan made the truth feel even heavier. "We need to move carefully," Malik said after a long pause. "We can't just rush into this. There are too many people involved. And if we're not careful, we'll end up being the ones in trouble." Jordan agreed. And they discussed the next steps. They needed evidence. Something concrete that would tie the corruption together. They also needed to protect themselves from the people who would stop at nothing to protect their secrets. It wasn't just about exposing the truth anymore. It was about staying alive long enough to bring justice to those who had been silenced for years. The days that followed were a blur of paperwork, interviews, and late-night strategizing. Malik couldn't escape the feeling that they were being watched. The quiet sense of paranoia that had been building in him for weeks now felt like a constant companion. He started noticing the same black SUVs following him. And he couldn't help but wonder who was behind them. Were they just the remnants of Caleb Mitchell's supporters? Or was someone else pulling the strings? Despite the mounting pressure, Malik refused to back down. He knew what was at stake, not just for him, but for the community that had placed its trust in him. There were families who had been hurt by the very system he was trying to reform. People whose lives had been shattered by corruption and abuse of power. The weight of their stories drove him forward, even when the path seemed impossibly difficult. One evening, after a long day in court, Malik returned home to find Amora waiting for him, her concerned eyes following his every move. She could see the toll the investigation was taking on him, and though she was proud of his determination, she couldn't help but worry. He had always been the strong one, the one who carried their family forward with unwavering resolve. But now, she could see the cracks in his armor, the exhaustion that was beginning to show. "Malik," she said softly, her voice filled with empathy, "you need to take a break. You're running on fumes." Malik glanced at her, his face weary but resolute. "I can't, Amora. Not until this is over. There's too much to lose." Amora stepped closer, placing a hand on his shoulder. "I understand. But you have to take care of yourself too. We can't fight this if you're not in the best shape to do so." Her words lingered in his mind long after she had gone to bed. He knew she was right. But the thought of stepping back, even for a moment, felt impossible. How could he afford to rest when there were so many people counting on him? How could he let his guard down when the forces he was up against were so powerful? The next day, Malik met with Jordan again, and they discussed their next move. It was clear that the investigation was starting to heat up. They needed to act quickly before the walls closed in on them. But as Malik looked around the room, surrounded by evidence of the corruption that had poisoned the police department, one thing was certain: he would not give up. No matter the obstacles, no matter the threats, he would fight for justice. For the victims. For the truth. And for his family. Malik had always believed in the system, in the rule of law, and in the idea that justice, no matter how slow or difficult, would always prevail. But as the investigation continued, and the pressure mounted, he began to question how much of that belief was still intact. The deeper he dug into the corruption within the police department, the more he realized just how broken the system was. The very institutions he had dedicated his life to protecting seemed to be rotting from the inside out. At home, Amora tried to help him process the toll it was taking on him, but he could see the worry in her eyes. It wasn't just the long hours and the endless meetings with allies who seemed more and more uncertain about the future. It was the emotional weight of the work itself. The stories of the victims. The shattered lives. The families who had lost everything at the hands of those sworn to protect them. It was all becoming too much to carry on his own. Malik, you're not alone in this, Amora said one evening as they sat together in their living room. You don't have to carry all of this by yourself. He sighed deeply, his shoulders heavy with the weight of his responsibilities. I know, Amora. But sometimes it feels like the whole world is falling apart. Every time we get closer to exposing the truth, I feel like the people we're fighting against are a step ahead of us. I don't know how much longer I can keep this up. Amora's eyes softened with understanding. She knew that Malik was a man of unwavering conviction. But she also knew that even the strongest person could break under the pressure. You're doing the right thing, Malik. You have to keep fighting. For them. For us. But you need to take care of yourself too. We'll face this together. Her words were a comfort. But they didn't ease the heavy burden that weighed on his heart. He had committed himself to the cause of justice. But at what cost? Each day seemed to bring new challenges, new risks. And the toll was starting to show. He was exhausted. His mind constantly spinning with strategy, evidence, and the ever-present threat of retaliation. The next morning, as he prepared for another day of meetings, he was reminded of the moment when this all began, the day Officer Caleb Mitchell had tried to take their newborn twins. That day had marked the beginning of a journey that Malik had never expected. It had started as a personal battle to protect his family. But now it had become so much more. This was no longer just about him, Amora, or even their children. It was about the people who had been silenced for years, about the communities that had been systematically oppressed, and about the truth that had been buried beneath layers of lies and corruption. At the courthouse, the atmosphere was thick with tension. Malik felt the weight of the entire city on his shoulders as he prepared to face yet another round of legal challenges. He had seen the resistance growing within the courthouse, former allies now avoiding him, afraid of the consequences of supporting his investigation. But Malik refused to back down. He had come too far, and the stakes were too high. As he walked into the courtroom, he could feel the eyes of the people on him. Some of them were supporters, others were skeptics. But Malik knew that no matter how this trial ended, he had to stand tall. He had to continue the fight. For the sake of the victims. For the sake of the truth. And for the future of justice itself. Throughout the trial, Malik faced constant pushback. Caleb Mitchell's defense attorneys were relentless, throwing every legal tactic they could think of to discredit the victims and undermine the evidence. But Malik remained calm, focused on the facts, and on the faces of those who had suffered at the hands of the corrupt system. He could feel their presence with him, urging him to press on. The days in court were long and exhausting, but Malik's resolve never wavered. Each victory, no matter how small, brought him closer to the truth, and every setback, though painful, only made him more determined. He could not allow the forces of corruption to win. He would see this through to the end, no matter the cost. He knew that this struggle, this fight for justice, was only just beginning. Malik had become a familiar figure at the courthouse, not just as a judge but as a symbol of relentless determination. Every day, as he walked through the marble halls, he could feel the stares, the whispers, the undercurrents of unease. He had known for a long time that his fight for justice would not be easy. But lately, it seemed as though the walls were closing in. His efforts to expose Officer Caleb Mitchell's corruption were making waves. But they were also stirring up resistance, forces determined to maintain the status quo. The weight of this tension settled over him every time he entered the courtroom. People had begun to take sides, some openly supporting him, while others subtly distanced themselves, unwilling to risk their own careers in the fight. Malik couldn't blame them. He knew how dangerous this path was. Yet, he couldn't stop. There was too much at stake. And he could feel the lives of the victims and the hope for a better future resting on his shoulders. One morning, just as he was entering the courthouse, he ran into Judge Hamilton, a respected member of the bench who had always been a mentor to Malik. The older man's face was drawn, his eyes weary. It was clear that he had something on his mind, and Malik knew this conversation would not be an easy one. "Malik," Judge Hamilton began, his voice low, almost as if speaking the words aloud might make them more real. "You've made quite a name for yourself in this investigation. But I need to warn you, son. You're making enemies. Powerful ones. People who can ruin your career, your life, and everything you've worked for." Malik's heart sank. He had known this day would come, but hearing it from someone he respected made it feel even more real. "I'm not going to stop, Judge," he said, his voice steady but firm. "This is bigger than me. This is about making sure this never happens again. About holding people accountable. We can't keep turning a blind eye to corruption." Judge Hamilton sighed deeply, as if the weight of the situation was too much for him to carry. "I understand. I do. But sometimes, justice comes with a price, Malik. And you might find yourself paying it more dearly than you realize." Malik nodded, his jaw tight with determination. "I've already paid a price. But I won't let it end here. Not until Caleb Mitchell answers for his crimes. And not until the system that enabled him is dismantled." The conversation lingered in his mind as he walked into the courtroom later that day. It seemed as though everywhere he turned, there were reminders of how high the stakes were. The lawyers for Mitchell were growing more aggressive in their tactics, casting doubt on the testimonies of the victims, attacking their credibility at every turn. But Malik refused to let them get to him. He had prepared for this. He had to stay focused. If he faltered now, it would all be for nothing. As the trial continued, Malik felt the pressure building. He noticed how the room seemed to shrink with each passing day, as if the walls were closing in around him. The people who had once been his allies, his colleagues, fellow judges, and friends were becoming increasingly distant. He would glance at them in the courtroom and see them avert their eyes, unwilling to make eye contact. Some of them, he knew, were terrified. They were afraid of what would happen if they stood beside him. The corruption ran deep, and it seemed like every day, more people were realizing how far it reached. Malik knew the risks. He had been warned, after all. But that didn't matter. Justice demanded action. And he couldn't back down now. The community needed him. And the victims needed him to fight for them. If he didn't, who would? That evening, as Malik sat at his desk, reviewing case files and preparing for the next day's trial, a feeling of unease settled over him. He couldn't shake the sense that something was about to happen, something that would shift everything. The stakes were higher than ever, and he knew that no matter how this trial ended, it was just the beginning of a larger battle. As he put down the case files and walked to the window, looking out over the city, he felt the weight of his responsibility more acutely than ever. But amidst the fear, the pressure, and the looming uncertainty, one thing was clear: he couldn't give up. Not now. Not ever. He had started this fight, and he would see it through to the end. Malik had been fighting for justice for so long that the lines between his personal life and his professional mission had blurred. His days had become a blur of courtroom battles, late-night research, and conversations with colleagues who shared his goal of exposing Officer Caleb Mitchell's corrupt practices. Yet, as time passed, the cost of this pursuit began to show. The stress of dealing with pushback from all sides, coupled with the danger of his investigation, had begun to take a toll on his health and his peace of mind. One evening, after a particularly grueling day at the courthouse, Malik was walking home, lost in thought about the trial and the mounting tension. The streets were dimly lit, and the air had a sharp bite to it. As he passed a row of parked cars, something caught his eye: a black SUV parked across the street, its engine idling. Malik stopped for a moment, his instincts kicking in. He glanced around, trying to appear casual, but something about the vehicle felt wrong. It was too still, too deliberate in its positioning. It hadn't been there when he first walked by. For a brief moment, he wondered if it was just his imagination. But deep down, he knew better. It was a feeling he had been carrying for weeks now, the growing sense that he was being watched. He had felt it at the courthouse, in the hallways, during his drives to and from work. But now it was real. The SUV had been following him, and though it could be a coincidence, Malik knew better than to ignore the signs. With a deep breath, Malik kept walking, his pace steady but measured. He made a sharp turn down another street, keeping an eye on the rearview mirror of his mind, waiting for the SUV to pass or turn. But it didn't. It followed him. Adrenaline surged through him. But Malik didn't panic. He had learned long ago that panic was a luxury he couldn't afford. His mind raced, thinking through his options. He could confront the vehicle, try to call for help, but that might escalate things. No, the smarter move was to remain calm, to lead whoever was following him into a place where he could confront them on his own terms. He turned onto a narrow alley, hoping the SUV would follow. It did. Just as he expected. The alley was quiet, with only the distant sounds of traffic echoing off the buildings. He had always been a strategist. And now, in the dim light of the alley, he had to outsmart whoever was behind him. He slowed down, giving the vehicle a few moments to get closer, then abruptly turned into a side street, hoping the SUV would lose track of him. But the black SUV didn't stop. It followed, close enough now that Malik could almost feel the heat from its headlights. His heart pounded, but he forced himself to remain focused. He couldn't afford to make a mistake. He quickly ducked into another alley and paused, hidden in the shadows, watching as the vehicle drove by, its engine humming softly. When he was sure the coast was clear, Malik let out a long breath, his pulse racing. He had evaded them, for now. That night, when Malik returned home, he found himself unable to shake the feeling that the danger had just escalated. He didn't tell Amora about the SUV. She already worried too much about him, and he didn't want to add more fear to the already heavy weight she carried. But he couldn't ignore what had happened. It wasn't just a coincidence, someone was keeping an eye on him. And the people watching him weren't just ordinary citizens, they were connected to the system he was fighting. The next morning, Malik called his trusted colleague, Detective Jordan Hayes. Jordan had been one of the few to support him from the beginning, and Malik needed someone who understood the gravity of the situation. "Jordan, I think I've just been followed," Malik said quietly, his voice heavy with the weight of the realization. "I need you to check into it. Something's not right." Jordan's response was immediate. "I'll take care of it. But be careful, Malik. This isn't just about exposing Mitchell anymore. There are people out there who will go to any length to keep the truth from coming out." Malik knew that. The threats, the surveillance, it was all part of the game now. But it wasn't just about him anymore. It was about the victims, about the people who had suffered in silence for far too long. And he couldn't stop. No matter how dangerous it became, no matter who was watching him, Malik knew that he had to finish what he had started. He stared out the window, feeling the weight of his responsibility more acutely than ever before. This was no longer just a fight for justice. It was a fight for survival. As the investigation into Officer Caleb Mitchell gained traction, the pressure on Malik only intensified. What had started as a solitary pursuit of justice was now a public spectacle, with each development scrutinized by the press, the public, and the very institutions Malik had spent years working within. The once steady rhythm of his life had been replaced by a constant hum of tension, an undercurrent of unease that followed him everywhere. At first, it had been whispers in the courthouse, murmurs behind closed doors about his efforts to take down one of their own. But as the evidence mounted, those whispers grew louder, turning into open challenges. His colleagues, those who had once respected him, now looked at him with a mix of admiration and suspicion. The questions were never directly asked, but they lingered in the air. Was he making a mountain out of a molehill? Was it really worth the trouble? And, perhaps most troubling, some of them began to wonder if Malik had been compromised by his own convictions, whether his sense of justice had led him into dangerous waters. The media was another battleground. Every time Malik stepped into the public eye, reporters were quick to follow, eager to get a quote, to catch him in a vulnerable moment. The pressure was mounting. The public was watching him closely, waiting for him to falter, waiting for any sign of weakness. For them, Malik had become a symbol, but symbols could be easily shattered. Despite the growing opposition, Malik remained focused on his mission. But the weight of public scrutiny had begun to affect him more than he'd expected. The stares, the whispered conversations, the subtle avoidance, it all began to wear on him. Even his interactions with Amora had started to shift. She, too, felt the strain of being in the public eye, of having their lives examined and critiqued by those who knew nothing of their personal struggles. One evening, as Malik and Amora sat together at the kitchen table, she put down her coffee cup, her expression serious. "Malik, I can see it. You're not yourself anymore. This fight, it's taking so much from you. Are you sure this is the right way?" Malik looked at her, the weight of her concern heavy on his chest. Amora had always been his rock, the one person who could see through his facade, who knew when he was struggling. He wanted to reassure her, to tell her that everything would be fine, that this fight was necessary. But he couldn't. Because deep down, he wasn't sure anymore. "I can't stop now, Amora," he said, his voice low. "I have to see this through. We can't let Caleb's actions go unchecked. Not after everything he's done." She nodded slowly, her gaze softening. "I know. But I'm worried. Malik, I'm worried about you." Malik squeezed her hand, grateful for her unwavering support, but also burdened by the fear that he was pulling her into a battle she hadn't chosen. She hadn't signed up for this kind of life. And neither had he. Not when it meant risking everything they had worked so hard to build. The next day, the pressure grew even more suffocating. Malik had been called into a meeting with several senior officials from the police department. He had expected it, the increasing tension had made this moment inevitable. But still, when he walked into the conference room, it felt like the walls were closing in. The chief of police, a man Malik had known for years, sat at the head of the table. His expression was unreadable, but the tension in his eyes was clear. "Malik," the chief began, his tone cold, "I'm afraid your investigation has become a liability. You've stirred up too much attention. And now there are concerns about the department's reputation. You need to step back." Malik felt the sting of those words like a slap to the face. He had expected resistance, but the bluntness of it was jarring. The chief wasn't interested in the truth or in justice, he was interested in preserving the image of the department. And Malik knew that. "I can't do that," Malik replied firmly. "Not when there are lives at stake. Not when a man like Mitchell is still out there, doing harm." The room fell silent for a moment, and Malik could feel the weight of everyone's gaze on him. They weren't just trying to pressure him, they were trying to break him, to make him doubt his path. But Malik stood tall, his resolve as unshakable as ever. This fight was no longer just about Mitchell. It was about standing up against a system that had long turned a blind eye to the truth. The chief's voice was tight with frustration. "You're making enemies, Malik. Powerful enemies. And if you're not careful, you'll lose everything." Malik took a deep breath, the weight of the words settling in his chest. But he wasn't afraid. He had come too far to back down now. "I'm already risking everything," he said quietly, "and I won't stop until justice is served." As the meeting ended, Malik walked out of the room, the pressure mounting around him. But his determination only strengthened. He couldn't afford to be deterred now. The final moments of Caleb Mitchell's trial were a blur. The culmination of a battle Malik had fought for so long. The courtroom was filled with a tense anticipation, the air thick with the weight of years of injustice, the hopes of victims, and the expectations of a public eager for resolution. As Malik sat in his seat, listening to the closing arguments, a quiet sense of finality settled within him. This was the moment everything had been building toward. Throughout the trial, Malik had maintained an unwavering focus on the truth. The testimony of countless victims had painted a damning picture of Caleb Mitchell's abuse of power. But it was Amora's voice, steady and powerful, that had made the most impact. Her words, filled with pain and courage, had pierced through the facade of the officer's defense, exposing his malice for the world to see. Despite the gravity of the situation, Malik found himself reflecting on everything that had led to this moment: the long days of investigation, the countless sleepless nights, and the tension that had come with being the public face of a fight against the system. It had cost him so much: his peace, his privacy, and at times, his own sense of self. Yet, in the end, it had been worth it. As the judge delivered the verdict, the room fell silent. Guilty, the word echoed in Malik's ears, and for a moment, the weight of it seemed almost too much to bear. It was the justice he had sought, the justice his community had demanded. But it was also the end of a long chapter. Caleb Mitchell, the man who had tormented so many, was going to prison. But even as Malik allowed himself a brief moment of relief, he knew that the battle wasn't over. This was just the beginning. After the verdict, there was a brief period of chaos, reporters swarming the courthouse, taking pictures, asking questions. But Malik ignored them, his eyes searching for Amora in the crowd. When their eyes met, he saw the quiet pride in her gaze, the acknowledgement of the fight they had fought together. He walked toward her, and for the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to exhale. "Is it over?" Amora asked softly, her voice filled with a mixture of hope and exhaustion. Malik nodded, his expression somber. "It's just the beginning, Amora. It's never really over." Later that evening, as they sat together in their living room, Malik thought about the journey that had brought them here. The fight for justice had been a long and difficult one, but it had also been one of profound transformation. It had shown him the depth of his own resolve, the strength of his relationship with Amora, and the power of standing up for what was right, no matter the cost. But Malik also knew that the road ahead was far from simple. Caleb Mitchell's conviction was a victory, but it was just one small part of a much larger system that needed to be addressed. The fight against corruption, racism, and abuse of power didn't end with one trial. It required sustained effort, collective action, and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. "Malik, I'm so proud of you," Amora said, her voice breaking through his thoughts. He smiled at her, feeling the weight of her words. "We did this together, Amora. Without you, I couldn't have kept going." In the weeks that followed, Malik and Amora, with the support of their friends and allies, began working on initiatives to bring about meaningful reform within the police department. Malik's position as a judge gave him a platform, and he was determined to use it to push for transparency, accountability, and change. But as the momentum of their work grew, so too did the challenges. The system was entrenched, and those who had benefited from its corruption were not going to let go easily. Yet Malik knew that the battle was worth fighting. Because the moment Caleb Mitchell was convicted was not just a personal victory, it was a victory for everyone who had been silenced by the system. For everyone who had suffered in silence, waiting for someone to speak up. It was a victory for the future. As the years passed, Malik's work became a symbol of hope for those who had been marginalized and oppressed. His fight had sparked a movement, and the changes that followed were not easy or immediate. But they were real. The police department, once a symbol of corruption, was now slowly but surely being reformed. Its officers held accountable for their actions. Malik's legacy would never be one of easy victories or quick fixes. But it would be one of profound change. A testament to the power of standing firm in the face of injustice, to the strength of love and empathy, and to the courage it takes to fight for what is right. As he sat with Amora, watching their children play in the yard, Malik couldn't help but feel a deep sense of peace. The fight was not over, but they had won a crucial battle. And that, in itself, was a victory worth celebrating.